Hey, good morning, church family. So, my name is Ryan. I'm going to be leading us in Sunday school this morning. We're going to be in John chapter 9, and we're going to be jumping around a bit, so I'll give you the verses as we come to them. So, here we go. John chapter 9, verse 1. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back, able to see. Verse 15. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. Others said, How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. Verse 24. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that although I was blind, now I see. Verse 30. The man answered, Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, You were born entirely in sins, and you're trying to teach us? And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said to him, You have seen him. The one who is speaking with you is he. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. All right, so the man born blind met Jesus and was healed by Jesus. So here's a question for us. Having met Jesus and received healing, what does the blind man know? What does the blind man know about the nature of his own healing? What does the blind man know about the ministry and life of Jesus? And the answer for both questions seems to be not everything and not nothing. He doesn't know everything, but he doesn't know nothing. He knows some things. The blind man knows the procedure by which he was healed, because he recounts it in verse 15. He knows that Jesus is not an ordinary guy. He says as much in verses 25 and 33. But he's not entirely certain after being healed about who exactly Jesus is. He expresses this uncertainty in verses 35 and 36. So the man born blind isn't completely in the dark, but he doesn't know everything. And can I just say that as a master's student here in statistics at BGSU, recording this from my apartment with finals week exactly 5 weeks away, I've never sympathized more with the man born blind. If you read verse 15 again, it's almost kind of funny. Verse 15 says, The Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see. And I can almost imagine the Pharisees standing there like, yeah, and how does that work, right? I mean, that's not the complete answer. That's not the answer they probably wanted. It's a superficial answer. And I can imagine the healed man saying, like, look, I know you want a fuller explanation. I know you want answers, but I haven't got them, right? I don't have those answers. That guy has my complete sympathy. And speaking of math and stat stuff, here's a book that you probably didn't expect to see in a Sunday school lesson. Hope it's in frame. It's a calculus book, and it's a pretty standard one. It's a book that a math or physics or engineering or stats student, undergrad student would be expected to be familiar with. And despite the fact that calculus gets a bad rap as a difficult sequence of courses, the math in that book, it's usually more procedural than conceptual. It's more about how to calculate stuff than it is about wrapping your head around thorny ideas. And the idea with a book like this is to help students develop some intuition for basic ideas, and then to give them rules to crunch those numbers. So calculus students of a book like this one, they will know things like the chain rule and the product rule and the substitution rule and L'Hopital's rule and a bunch of other rules like that. And books like that are sometimes they're referred to disparagingly as cookbooks, because they help you to develop some loose intuition. And then what they give you is just recipes for calculating important quantities. So developing the underlying theory of calculus and really cultivating a rigorous understanding of how all those rules work and why those recipes are the way they are, that is saved for a later course called advanced calculus that a lot of students don't even have to take. And advanced calculus is often taught from a deceptively slim book like this one. This is a famous advanced calculus text. And so calculus is taught kind of in two stages. There's the intuitive version, and then there's the more rigorous version. And I completely understand why it's taught in those two stages, because I'm one of the few people who made the mistake of listening to the good advice I found on the internet that told me to basically ignore the first version, ignore a book like this that you would spend a year on in a university, right? Ignore this and just go straight for the advanced calculus stuff. That's the advice I got online. So that's the advice that I followed when I tried to teach myself this stuff. And that turns out to be really bad advice, because the ideas that you find in an advanced calculus text, they're pretty abstract. And if you haven't gone through a more basic development of calculus, they're not just abstract, but they're entirely unmotivated. It's not clear where the ideas come from or why anyone should care. So the lesson that I had to learn the hard way is that procedures come first and then concepts come later. And the idea is to give the learner something tangible that they can wrap their heads and their hands and their pencils around. And then you can come back and fill in the gaps and back everything up with concepts later. But you should show them first and then tell them later. And I mention all this because I can't help but see the same idea in John 9. Jesus could simply have walked up to the man born blind and said, like, bam, healed, right? 100%. Next, right? He didn't do that. And why didn't he do that? I don't know. But one thing seems pretty clear. By administering healing in the very procedural way, the kind of stepwise way that he does, step 1, get dirt. Step 2, spit in dirt. Step 3, apply mud to eyes. Step 4, wash in the pool of Siloam. By doing it this way, Jesus is doing what calculus teachers have learned to do. That is, he's adapting his method to accommodate the expectations of the uninitiated, right? And as a consequence, when the healed man is later asked in verse 15 how it is that he can see, like, hey, aren't you that blind guy? When he's eventually asked about his healing, the man actually has a response. It's not a great response, right? It's not a Christologically robust response, but it is a response. He has something to say. There's something that he has understood, and he has something to communicate now to others. And this is because, again, Jesus framed the healing in a way that the blind man could comprehend, and in a way that equipped the blind man with a testimony. So this is important because so much of Jesus' ministry is just this very thing. It's making the incomprehensible comprehensible, making the unseen seen, making the unknown known, restoring not only natural sight, but spiritual sight. So here's a question for you. Did the blind man have faith? Did the blind man have faith? Well, sure he did, right? He had faith enough to follow Jesus' instructions to wash in the pool of Siloam. That's verse 7. Faith enough to witness to Jesus' healing in verse 25. Faith to push back like big time. He got kind of sarcastic. Push back big time against the criticisms of the Pharisees in verses 30 through 33. Faith enough to accept Jesus as a witness of himself in verse 37. Faith enough to worship in verse 38. So what can we learn about faith from chapter 9 of John? Well, just quickly, here's 3 things that we see about faith as revealed to us in John 9. The first is that faith requires neither perfect knowledge nor complete understanding. I'll say that again. Faith requires neither perfect knowledge nor complete understanding. You can look, but you won't find a verse where the blind man just suddenly arrives at a complete understanding of the person and ministry of Jesus, or even a complete understanding of his own healing. Instead, we see that his faith matures throughout the chapter. And Paul understood this. Paul understood that faith doesn't require perfect knowledge or complete understanding. In his letter to the Colossians, Paul writes that we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. That's Colossians 1, 9 through 10. So why is it that Paul is asking? Why is it that Paul is praying that the Colossian church be filled with knowledge and wisdom and understanding? Because he understands that they don't have perfect knowledge, they don't have perfect wisdom, they don't have perfect understanding. Paul's essentially saying, look, I don't expect you to have everything figured out. In fact, I know you don't have it all figured out, and that's okay. I'm praying for you. This leads to the second observation. Faith will actually be characterized by an incomplete understanding. Faith will be characterized by an incomplete understanding. I'm not going to elaborate on this too much because you see it all throughout John 9. Again, there was never a point where the blind man has complete faith, not even after, has complete understanding or complete knowledge, not even after he's been healed. But it would be wrong to say that he doesn't have faith. Faith will be characterized by incomplete understanding. And then the third observation, genuine faith leads to worship. We see this in verse 38. One more time, verse 38 says simply, he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. In verse 38 is kind of all we get. It's like there's this small window that opens onto the life of the man born blind, and it remains open for 38 verses, and then it just slams shut, and that's all we get. What did the rest of his life look like? Well, we don't know. Did he keep giving testimonies like the one he gave in verse 30 through 33? Did he take the healing and run? Like, did he just forget about Jesus, the one who healed him? Did he live the rest of his life as just a normal guy that could see and forgot about the origin of his healing? I mean, I hope not. But one of the things I want to say is that I think it's easy for us to read verses like this and to lionize figures like the man born blind. It's easy for us to imagine that the lives of people like that are somehow qualitatively dissimilar to our own, right? Like the man born blind met Jesus and it just changed his life forever, and he couldn't have gotten off track if he wanted to. I don't know that that's the case. I think when chapter 9 closes, we have a guy that has the rest of his life to live and lots of other decisions to make. And for better or for worse, there's probably lots of ways that he could have lived his life that are all consistent with his having met Jesus and been healed. There's room for all kinds of possibilities. We don't know how his life played out. I'll tell you that eventually, I went back and I read this book. So eventually I was able to make sense of it. And so I understand it now, right? I know what's in here and wrap my head around that stuff. And along the way, I've learned a few things about math. And one of the things I've learned is that math is kind of like this. In the beginning, teachers will emphasize the intuitive nature of basic ideas, as in, like, these ideas make sense, don't they? And this works because in the beginning, the ideas are often very appealing and sensible and intuitive. And there's what you think on the one hand, and there's what the math actually says on the other. And in the beginning, a good teacher is able to rightly convince you that the distance between these two things is really pretty small. It's much less than you would have imagined, right? But math really isn't about appealing to your intuition. In fact, math is, I would say it's about the opposite. Math is about training your intuition to conform to a body of knowledge and a way of thinking, which is very much external to and sometimes even opposed to your intuition. Math is less about downplaying the distance separating intuition from mathematical fact and more about like acknowledging that distance when it exists and then doing the hard work to align your pliable, mobile intuition with just hard, immovable facts of mathematics, right? There's what you think on the one hand and there's what the math says on the other, and the more that you learn, the wider that gap can grow. I mean, the gap between how you think it should go and how it does go can become arbitrarily wide, unfortunately. And maybe it's the same with faith. Maybe it's the same with this chapter. Jesus tells the blind man in verse 3, like, great news, right? The only reason you were born blind is that so God's works might be revealed in you. Jesus says, in effect, you want to see and I want to heal you. So at the beginning of his spiritual journey, the blind man's desires and God's desires just completely coincide, no distance between those two at all. And sometimes life is like that, and that's great. But I bet it wasn't like that every hour of every day for the rest of the blind man's life. I imagine that as the blind man matured and as more was expected of him spiritually, he could sometimes feel how wide the distance was between his desires and God's desires for his life, between his nature and God's. And I can imagine that if we could talk to the blind man, I could just imagine him saying, you know, Jesus told me to go wash. That's the part of my story that you guys read about. Jesus told me to go wash, but it turns out that my whole life was like that. I just kept receiving instructions, and I had to exercise faith every time to follow them. And it's the same for you and I. Every instruction we have to exercise faith to follow it. So that's the end of the Sunday school lesson. I would tell you that uh, every time I do one of these Sunday school lessons, I always end up feeling like I've missed a million things, and I probably have. So I would just encourage you, invite you to go back through and read on your own and pick up on all the many things that I left out and forgot to include. Didn't do that by design, but I know that I always get this sense of the things that I said and the things that there are to say. There's all the difference in the world between those two, and that I always feel like I missed out on a bunch of stuff. So I would encourage you to go back and reread it on your own and see what you can glean. And have a lovely Sunday. Bye bye.